why it's critical to apply the risk management framework to your IT modernization plan. Our presenter, Dave Buster. So Dave is an industry veteran with over 35 years of experience in design and product management of technology solutions. Dave spent over 13 years with Cisco Systems supporting federal government agencies with data security architectures. Later, Dave worked in smart grid storage and financial industries as a security architect. Now, with global knowledge, Dave manages a worldwide portfolio for cybersecurity courses. Dave has a Bachelor of Science in Engineering, an MBA from North Carolina State University. He also holds these CompTIA Security Plus and CISSP certifications.
Very happy to be here today. As Sarah said, I've got a lot of experience in this stuff, and I've actually implemented this framework. And I realized that we're going to be talking about a framework that's sort of promulgated by the U.S. government, but actually it's being used worldwide. I've talked to a lot of people in Europe and Canada, North America, South America that are using this same risk management framework. And one of the reasons for that is that it just works. It's a good way to get your arms around what risk management is and where to start and dive into the problem of managing risk. So we're going to go through that today. The first thing I want to talk about is this is kind of a view of what we're going to do. I view this as what we call a terrain mapping exercise. We're going to go at 30,000 feet and look at all the parts of what's going on when we talk about what a risk management framework is. To give it some context, we're going to give you a little background on the organization's laws and things that came together to cause the risk management framework to be created. And that's important to understand it. So when you're working with it, you understand why it existed, why it was brought forth, and that sort of thing. Then we'll talk about the risk management framework itself, and then we'll talk about different ways of employee development to support the risk management framework. So along the way, if you have any questions, type them in the chat box. If I don't notice them on my screen, I'm sure Sarah can jump in and warn me about it. And we'll try to answer those as we go. And also at the end, we'll have some time to take questions as well. So as we dive into this, the first thing to understand is the FISMA. This is the United States Federal Information System Modernization Act. It happened back in 2002. It was one of the first times that legislators in the U.S. government actually realized that the government has a responsibility around cybersecurity, you know, for the nation as a whole. And it also wanted to establish in legislative documents the fact that agency heads are accountable for the cybersecurity of their agencies. Up until then, people just sort of shrugged. It was sort of, you know, indeterminate as to what level of activity, you know, the cybersecurity would get in particular agencies in the government, and also with contractors and things like that. So over time, the FISMA kind of grew up, and as it became implemented, the government set aside one particular organization inside the U.S. federal government called the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This organization is a part of the U.S. Commerce Department, so it falls under trade, and that's the same organization that manages weights and measures, for example. You know, the kilogram and the pound and the meter and the foot, all those things they keep the standards there. But because this was a technology-oriented organization and it was also oriented toward commerce, and that they gave the cybersecurity responsibility to NIST as well. NIST had already been doing a lot of research on cybersecurity, and it just seemed like the logical place to put it. Over time, the FISMA, you know, it was the Security Management Act. They started calling it the Security Modernization Act, and there's a reason for that. There's a little bit of politics in the U.S. government where modernization became the buzzword for IT, and that's because they realized they were still running systems from the 60s and they needed to update them. So FISMA became the starting line, the starting point for a lot of these types of activities. NIST became the focus organization that was supposed to put together a cybersecurity strategy, and they did that in terms of the cybersecurity risk management framework. So as we move into the NIST model, NIST started creating documents, and they created something called special publications. These are all available online for free, just PDFs. You just download them and read them, and they have greatly outgrown their original scope and concept, both in the amount of information they cover and also the audience that they apply to. Many countries around the world are starting to subscribe to these same policies, these publications, simply because they don't have anything else to use. They just kind of work, and they work pretty well, and so everybody uses them. So I've worked with governments in Europe and also in Canada, and they're all kind of looking at these same special publications. It's a free service. It's a free asset that you can use and apply. More recently, when I was involved with public utilities and smart grid and doing architectures, and when I was involved with the financial community, they were using these things as well. It wasn't a requirement. There was no legal requirement to do it, but it was the best framework available for what they wanted to do, so everybody started doing it. So as you dive into these special publications, you'll find there's quite a lot of different types of documents involved. The interesting thing, though, is that they're not really in order. You see a note there. They're not in order. It's best to start with 800-37 and 800-39. Those are the kind of the high-level overview of what the risk management framework means, what it means to have risk management, and how you tackle that. You know, how you assess the maturity of an organization in the way they do risk management. It's not specific. It's very general, very high level. But you start there at 37 and 39, and then you dive down into the various documents. The one you'll probably spend the most time in will probably be 800-53, and I put that in the lower left-hand corner here. This becomes a little bit more prescriptive. It actually has some suggestions, and it starts to carve out the different areas of risk that you would see in a typical IT environment and how to address each of those types of risks. So this is probably where you'd start, but eventually you'll end up subscribing to all of these documents, reading them. Understand that these are living documents. They're continuously being revised and edited. There are committees that meet constantly and are adding things to them. The most recent things that are starting to go in there now have to do with mobility, IoT, those types of things. The next wave of changes coming in the next couple of years will probably be about artificial intelligence and those types of issues. So these are living documents. So you should probably take time to make sure you download the latest version every time you use it. As we move forward, NIST also created some other documents, the Federal Information Processing Standards, FIPS. These are documents that are a little bit more prescriptive. So the special publications we described before outlined what risk is and how to address risk, that sort of thing. These documents were really intended for civilian agencies, civilian government agencies, government contractors, and anyone else who's interested to understand specifically the steps they need to take in certain situations. So they are a bit more prescriptive, but they are the minimum standard. So for U.S. government entities and their contractors, these become the minimum requirements that they have to do. I mean, it's things like, password management and all those other types of things that you get into. Many other organizations and countries and other governments are also using these same things as their minimum standards just because they exist and they work. Now, in my experience, I used the three that we've listed here most often. The minimum security controls, number 200, is probably the most important one for most organizations. And then the 140-2 is what I used when I worked for vendors, and we had any sort of built-in encryption modules inside of a product. We had to meet FIPS 140-2. So all of these things come together to kind of create a baseline for security and for mitigating risk in an environment. So the next step forward here is what we do in the executive branch. Over the last few presidential administrations, both Democratic, Republican, whatever, there's been a steady progression toward more and more responsibility and authority in terms of the executive branch of our U.S. government. The most recent one, executive order, came out, and it was 2 years old this past May. It came out in 2016. But if you look back in time, previous administrations had issued an executive order that said, agency heads, you are responsible. And then the next administration issues an order that says, agency heads, you need to build a plan. The most recent order, that's the one on the screen now, says agency heads have to submit reports. It actually gives them an action item, an externally verifiable action item. So as we look at that, this is the first time that an executive order actually has some teeth to it. And I'm not going to give any one presidential administration credit for any of these things. These were all happening behind the scenes, but needed to happen. But the point is that now in the U.S. federal government, agency heads have to produce a risk management report, and they have to turn it in to the Office of Management and Budget from their money, and Homeland Security for their security. And so this gives them an action item that they must fulfill, or they're in violation of this executive order. It's important to understand this, that over time, the risks, the responsibilities of the agency heads has grown more and more intense, and they're being held more and more accountable. In order to meet this requirement to write a risk management report, they just about have to go through the NIST documents that we just described, go through them step by step, and make sure they are addressing every risk and taking every step that they're supposed to take. Now, moving forward, one of the things that was an outgrowth of 13800 was a separate section on the cybersecurity workforce. This is something that we'll come back to later in this discussion, but this came out just in May of this year. There's a special sensitivity to the fact that, if you're talking about risk at a high level, the risk management framework and what things cause risk and how to mitigate them, one of the most critical areas that needs to be addressed is the people that actually have to manage that risk. It's not just a technology problem, it's a people problem. And so this actually acknowledges that, and acknowledges the fact that we have to develop our personnel. So we see a lot more emphasis now on building a career ladder, career path, and a training path for people that are involved in cybersecurity. And that's probably a good thing for the industry. The interesting thing, though, is that even though this was originally conceived as a U.S. government document, a lot of people in private industry and a lot of other governments are using it as well, just because it works. Now let's go into the risk management framework itself and just give you a brief overview of how it works. What you see on the screen here is a baseline concept of the risk management framework. It's a cycle. It starts at the top. You have to categorize your systems. So this means that you have to inventory all the systems you have and subsystems and that sort of thing, understand what happens where, understand the priority of systems, understand why they exist, what they do to further the mission and goals of the organization, that sort of thing. Once you've done that and categorized them correctly, you can begin to select controls that mitigate risk. So any system that's actually operating in a live environment has some sort of risk. So you have to select the appropriate controls, and that means depending on the importance of the system, the sensitivity of the system, et cetera, you select controls that are appropriate. Then you implement those controls. It may be, putting password management systems in, or insider threat management systems, or intrusion systems, whatever controls you have to do, maybe just limiting access to files, but you implement those controls. Then you stop and assess the controls. You actually have to stop and think about, is this control doing what I want it to do? Very often there are unintended consequences. When a control is introduced into a system, it causes more damage than it fixes, so you've got to assess that. Now, once you get past that point, you authorize the system. That means actually put a system into production. It could be a simple application, or it could be a huge multi-organization complex system, but either way, you have to have a formal event where you authorize and put it into actual use. But the story doesn't stop there. Once a system is up and running and in production, you have to continue to monitor those controls, because we all know complex systems are dynamic beasts. They will continue to change over time. Anything that changes anywhere in the system could affect some of the controls that you introduced to reduce risk, and in fact could offset these controls. So you've got to continue monitoring that. And then this cycle starts again. You categorize the system, et cetera. Now in the circle you see there are some of those special publication documents and FIPS documents outlined as well around the circle. Those are the key documents that you would use when you're in that section of the whole thing. And as I said, 800-39 is the one that oversees the entire process. So you can look at that one to start with and then start going around the circle. So this is in effect the high level overview of what a risk management framework is. It helps you identify where your risks are, and then it makes suggestions about how to mitigate those risks. Understand that any information system has risk. There is no such thing as a risk-free system. The only way to have zero risk is to shut off the computer, power it down, encase it in concrete, and drop it in the ocean. But then it's not very useful. So we don't recommend that. Instead, rather than running away from risk, we learn to manage risk. So that's how we do it here. The other thing that should be brought out is risk needs to be managed at the enterprise level, at a very high level. If you have different departments in your organization and they manage risk differently, they could end up interfering with each other. Their mitigations could offset each other and actually reduce their effectiveness. So there's a really strong statement to be made that you need to manage risk at the highest level possible so that you get consistency across the entire organization. If one department has 8-character passwords and another department has 22-character passwords, you're just creating problems for yourself. So you gotta do that. And if you do these standards and guidelines effectively, you can actually mitigate risk efficiently. That means you spend less money managing risk if you do it in a proper framework in a straightforward manner. So this actually reduces the cost of risk if you follow these recommendations. One of the areas that we've identified as a significant part of risk is the workforce itself. If you have a system that's exposed to risk, one of the first places to start is the people that run it. So the NIST organization developed NICE. This is the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. And so this is a kind of a framework about how to fix the people that fix the systems. And it's outlined in this special publication 800-181. NICE establishes a common taxonomy and vernacular. In other words, they've defined words. They've created a vocabulary that everyone who works in this area should use. And if you have this common vocabulary when you're talking about something like analyze, you're both talking about the same thing, or investigate. You have a common agreement on what these words mean. So you start with that, and then the NICE workforce framework categories divide up into the 7 categories you see on the screen. This is developed from the bottom up. This is an analysis of cybersecurity tasks that must be done and actions that are taken, and you build these up from the very small granular area up until each one of these particular categories. The NICE framework has a significant amount of detail about what's included in these, and we'll talk about them. But keep in mind, we're talking about roles and responsibilities here. It is possible to take each of these categories and then map training courses to them. So that's what we've done here. This is just kind of an example. I mean, I think a lot of different training companies can do this, and people should do this with their own career. They figure out where they're going to work, which type of role they're going to have, and then they make sure they cover the courses that are in it. But this is all a reasonable thing to do, and we certainly encourage that. But as you can see, it can be complex. Even with these 7 categories, there's a lot of different training courses and things you can take. Now, another area to look at is 800-16, which is this role-based model. So if you look at those categories we just talked about, and you think about all the complexity underneath them, NICE went through this process of taking these things and organizing them in such a way that we can define what someone needs to know to do that. So they've defined something they call competencies, which are knowledge and skills, and proficiencies, which is the ability to use those knowledge and skills. And they built a model that helps us understand where the humans are in this value chain. We have to acknowledge that some people know some things and other people know other things, and some people are better at certain things and some are better at others, but everybody can be trained to some extent. So we want to have a way of kind of gauging where people are by breaking down into these granular skills and knowledge. So the way NIST thinks of it is that there's a kind of a path to expertise. And this is a little bit generic, but again, we're defining terms here. It's not intended to be a preschool kind of discussion, but it starts with knowledge. Knowledge at the base of the pyramid is where people start, where they learn a thing, learn facts, learn how things work, and kind of have an understanding of what's going on. The next level above that is skills, where they're able to apply the knowledge they have learned in order to do a particular task or accomplish a particular goal. The next level above that is competency. When you've mastered a skill and you've done it enough times that you're fairly sure that you can do it over and over again, then you have competency. And that's where we really strive to get to in this model. And above that, there's a special area for subject matter experts, where you become an expert. You have expertise that goes beyond what most people have in a particular area, and then you can be called on to help augment the pyramid for everyone else. Now, building this thing up is called proficiency. You get better and better as you go up, and it takes time. And so the NIST SP 800-16 kind of outlines, that kind of framework. In order to do that, they built a learning continuum. Now, the learning continuum looks at security awareness, security essentials, role-based training, education experience. We're going to dive into each of these, but the idea is that you build on what you've already learned. The simple fact is you have to have security awareness training across all users within an organization. And again, this is part of risk mitigation and a risk framework, is you get everybody some security training. So that means teaching people, don't click on suspicious emails, don't plug USB sticks into your computer, don't do this, don't do that, and just being generally aware of what's going on. The security essentials training goes to everyone with some sort of technical role, any technical role in the organization. They need to be just a little bit more on guard for certain things to be on the lookout for that look unusual, that need to be flagged. Then role-based training goes above that for people who are doing a little bit more into cybersecurity. We'll talk about that. And then finally, there's education experience that kind of goes on forever after that. You'll have people that get better and better and better at their jobs. So let's look at these in just a little bit more detail here. The first area is security awareness, and it's critically important that all individuals in an organization get some sort of training, that training is reinforced on a regular basis, and that they feel responsible for it. It's not enough to just say you should go off and learn this and come back. This needs to be reinforced. It needs to be measured. It needs to be reported on. And the people themselves need to have a sense of ownership of that they are responsible for knowing this sort of thing to protect the entire organization. So that becomes a critical factor, and absolutely everybody needs it. The next level up is security essentials. This is anybody who touches a system itself should have some basic security essential knowledge. They should know enough to know when something looks out of place. They should know enough to know when a system is has unusual behavior that indicate that it might be compromised. So, indicator of compromise occurs. These people have to know this happens. This doesn't mean they have to know how to fix it or even diagnose the problem, but at least be aware that something is unusual. They also, by virtue of the fact that they touch electronic systems, any kind of IT systems, they're going to have to be responsible to implement some of the policies, and it's best if they know a little bit about security so they know why they are required to do some of the things they're required to do. Otherwise, they're likely to bypass security controls, and that doesn't help anybody. So this is critical here. The next level up is role-based training. So these are people who are actually in cybersecurity. These are people in the organization that have knowledge and skills, and they have to apply those knowledge and skills to protect the system. So at this level, we're starting to recognize competencies among the trainees. Some people are good at things, some people are less good, and they need more training or more practice, that sort of thing. But these are people who have a relationship with the IT that is cybersecurity related. Now, once they move on beyond this, we get in an area of education experience, and this goes on forever. At this point, people have the basic skills necessary to do their cybersecurity job, and then they launch into this education experience phase where they continue to accumulate more and more experience, more and more education, some more on-the-job training, and their proficiency. Remember that proficiency arrow on the pyramid there? It continues to go up and up and up. This makes an organization stronger. It adds depth and to the organization and makes an organization more robust. This in turn then applies back to the risk management framework as a large group of individuals who can then apply the risk management framework. Now, we mentioned, I've been using some terms here, roles, knowledge, and skills. So let's dive into that just a little bit. A role is defined in certain terms, and it's mapped to knowledge and skills for that specific role. So, and I'm giving you definitions here. These come out of the NIST documents. So roles are defined by the position, what you do, what your tasks are. The title can vary, and we've seen various titles. Some people are called analysts, some people are called engineers. Maybe that doesn't really matter. The role is what it is. It's what you actually do. Now, NIST has gone to great detail and care to try to identify all the common roles in the cybersecurity world, and then identify all the knowledge and all the skills at a pretty granular level that are mapped to that role. So if you're in role X, you must know how to do this, and you must understand that. All these things must happen before you're competent in your role. Now, when you define that in a particular role, there isn't a hierarchy of knowledge and skills. Some people think some knowledge is more important than other knowledge. This doesn't try to define priority. It just says, here's the minimum level of knowledge and here's the minimum level of skill. You must have all this, in ready to roll to be in that role. Otherwise, you're not competent in that role. So we work through that kind of model. Now, if I were to break that down, so to put this in more concrete terms, this is kind of what it looks like. They put together a knowledge and skills catalog. So remember the area of security risk management, they've numbered the knowledge and skills. So this is RM1, this is risk management. So they've labeled these things. And so first, someone in this kind of role, security risk management, needs to have a skill in conducting vulnerability scans, needs skill identifying systemic security issues, etc. They need knowledge of applications, knowledge of penetration, knowledge. So all of these things are broken down. If a person possesses all of this skill and all of this knowledge, then they are appropriate to that role. But we break it down even further. I'll show you what we mean by that. There is also a mapping. So of all we were just looking at the security risk management, there are other jobs within the security risk management role. So for example, if you're managing people in security and risk management, you need RM-2, RM-25 through 28, and RM-31. These are skills and knowledge that you need to manage people in this role. If you're in the design phase of security risk management, you need RM8, RM18. Now, some of these, if you look across this, we have management, design, implement, evaluate, and this is all of them over here. some of these appear in more than one column. If you're implementing, you need RM1, and if you're evaluating, you also need RM1. So you need to be aware of those. But so there's a pretty detailed, granular breakdown of skills and knowledge required for these roles within cybersecurity. And NIST has put all this together for us, and there really isn't another place anywhere in the industry that has gone to this level of detail about it. So it's pretty handy to have. What we have found, though, is in private industry. So Global Knowledge, as you know, is a huge company. We train hundreds of thousands of students every year. We touch all different governments. We touch all of large corporations and small companies. We have staff of hundreds of subject matter experts that teach for us part-time, and they're full-time consultants, and then they work for us part-time, that sort of thing. So we have a reach across the industry that's unmatched by anybody. We have technology partners, you know, all the big vendors give us all of their roadmaps, and we work with them on their training as well. So we have a view of the universe that's a little bit broader than most other organizations in the world, and we've started to apply that. So I want to show you just a little bit about how we take the same kind of approach, slightly different view, to put together roles, responsibilities, that sort of thing. The first thing we'll do is develop a what we call the crown. This is a career path through an individual's career. Now you'll notice the NIST guidelines didn't talk about learning paths and things like that. So we wanted to make sure we include that in our model as well. So once you've gone through the NIST NICE framework, then you can look here. We have organized a lot of things into new to the role, mid-career, and senior leadership. New to role in cybersecurity means you need to be exposed to all facets of cybersecurity at a very, kind of a high level. Just go across the entire dictionary of all cybersecurity functions and understand how most of cybersecurity operates. That gets you started in a job. For the first year or two, that's where you should be spending your training. And then in the mid-career phase, we get into an area where we want people to start to specialize. It turns out that there is some specialization within cybersecurity. And I like to draw the analogy of an automobile mechanic. It used to be that automobile mechanics could work on any part of the car, and some still can, most can. But now we have specialists. We have, some that work on air conditioners, and some that work on transmissions, some that work on brakes. They've kind of specialized over the years, and there's a reason for that, because it's become so complex. Same thing has happened in the medical profession. It used to be general practitioner doctors would do everything, and now we have different types of doctors, from oncologists to surgeons, to allergists, whatever. So there is specialization, and that is a sign of maturity in a technological field. It shows that the complexity is there to support specialization. So at a mid-career, we expect students to start to specialize in particular areas of cybersecurity. Then at the senior leadership level, 7 to 10 years into a career, you have to think about your career path. So you're either going to go stay technical, be a subject matter expert, lead engineer, fellow, or whatever. You go down the middle here, you have architecture. You can be a senior architect or compliance auditor, that sort of thing. So you understand policy and why things exist, and you can design things. Or you go down to the management path. You become a chief information security officer, something like that. So we support things like that. So in terms of the skills and knowledge that NIST was laying out before, you get most of that coming up through the middle here, but we want to make sure people understand that for the risk management framework, you also have to have leadership that also supports it. Now, I mentioned the specialization here, and I want to show you just briefly what that looks like. So this is kind of a global knowledge view. These are not roles in the sense that NIST identifies roles as a summation of tasks and to create a role. These are jobs. These are actually career paths that we have found in the industry that people relate to. So if you talk to large companies especially, they generally divide their cybersecurity team up into these groups of people. So you'll have an architecture and policy group, data loss prevention, et cetera, all the way across the list here. As you go through these, each one of these may have an analysis phase, it may have a, an implementation, those types of things. So the risk management, the NIST framework fits inside each one of these things depending on what that team is responsible to do. So just going through them briefly here, architecture and policy is about designing secure architectures, how all the systems connect together, what policies will be used, across the board. Data loss prevention is about keeping malware out of systems. So this would be the people that implement the virus checkers and malware defense. Governance, risk, and compliance are the auditors for all of the other groups on the board here. Identity and access management has recently emerged as a new team that just manages passwords and authentication and management. With single sign-on, all these other technologies, that's become a very important area. Incident response and forensic analysis responds to an attack. So someone says, hey, I've got ransomware on my computer, what do I do? These are the guys they call. Very often, sometimes this is outsourced because smaller organizations just simply don't have the expertise to do this. Likewise, we have penetration testing. These are people who actually attack a system to see where the weaknesses are and then write a report about it. And often that is also outsourced as well. Secure DevOps, often called DevSecOps, is actually operating the systems, making sure they are operating in a compliant manner and make sure they're configured correctly according to all the policies that the architects put together and enforced by the GRC people over here. And then finally, secure software development. These are people who design the websites or people who write code for applications, either be used internally or to be sold, making sure that they are writing code and building applications that are secure, that they don't make common mistakes that would jeopardize the security of an application. So if you look at these 8 categories here, each one of these 8 can support some of the NIST framework. Now, again, we put in a bunch of courses. We map our courses, and I'm not going to go through any of this detail, but each of these 8 different job functions has beginner, intermediate, and expert level, and we map a bunch of courses to them. So that becomes very helpful. Meanwhile, the same thing has happened with DoD. So 8570 and now 8140. This is the United States Department of Defense has put some baseline certifications. The interesting thing is that our own Department of Defense and most large companies and other departments and other governments around the world are referring back to the same set of certifications as having value in the cybersecurity world. So if you look at this mapping, these are all certifications that the US DoD has approved and expects people to get. And they are exactly the same certifications that you get on the private industry side. So they're allowing for migration of people from private industry to the Department of Defense and to government agencies back and forth using the same credentials. And I think that's a valuable thing. This same model is being picked up by many other governments and many other large companies to endorse some of the same certifications. So in summary, I just wanted to outline what we've been through. We talked about the history a little bit. We talked about FISMA and where it was created, why it was created, and it simply established a charter that gave responsibility to this NIST organization in the US government. Then NIST started creating those special publications we talked about, 800-53, 37 and 39, all those documents. And that actually defines risk management and the framework itself. And there are training classes you can take on that if you want to get into that. The executive orders started establishing responsibility, that they were enforcing that risk management framework within the U.S. federal government, although a lot of other organizations are starting to follow the same path. And then we drove down specifically into one of the critical parts, which is personnel development. 800-16 defines the path to expertise, and we view personnel development as a critical path for risk management. So it becomes a part of the risk management framework itself. Over time, the goal is to develop long-term proficiencies for key personnel. This is a goal that should be established for any organization. You want to make sure you have a growing and dynamic organization. You're always feeding new people up through the systems. You don't want to put yourself in a position where a key person departs for whatever reason and you're left without that skill, that competency in your model.
When it comes to the risk management framework, where would you start when you're looking at implementing it or bringing it into your own organization?
Okay, the best place to start would be SP 800-37, SP 800-39. Read those. Then 800-53 gives some practical advice. You're going to end up with a big spreadsheet that's going to be like a checklist. And what you want to do is use the framework so that you're prioritizing your efforts in the place that has the most impact first. It's impossible to meet the entire risk management framework in one shot, but you can take steps if you prioritize what you're going to work on. And it may be making sure your firewalls are filtering everything, or it may be password management, or whatever. Whatever you choose, make sure it's working, and then move on to the next one. So I would say start with the documents, read them, and they will frame what you need to do from there.
Please visit our website for more live webinars, white papers, and any other special offers that we have going on. So I just wanted to thank you everyone for joining us today.